Hey everyone, I'm Mitch. I'm one of the pastors here, and we are celebrating the women in our lives all weekend long. I can't wait for you to hear it. So let's get going.
Life for her is probably harder than it would be for me as a guy, mostly because she has to deal with me.
Hey Emily, you're so fine, you blow my mind. Hey Emily.
I just think of general societal norms. My wife works hard all day. She's a teacher, which requires a ridiculous amount of patience. But if someone walked into that house, saw it was a mess, they're not saying, "Steve, your house is a mess. I'm ashamed of you." They immediately go right to my wife, even though it's really not her fault or solo her responsibility.
So back in 2021, we were in the process of moving to our new house and all that stuff. And then a couple days before we were actually supposed to move, I had a stroke and got laid up in the hospital for a week or two. And during that time, my wife, who is an absolute rock star, took on the whole moving process, getting everything moved, getting the kids all organized and all that stuff, all while I was unable to help even lift a single box.
If I could say one thing that would cheer on my wife or my daughter or my mom, it would be hang in there. They're all doing a great job.
What inspires me most about her is just the amount of faith that she has in her life that's kind of transpired to me. I mean, she's one of the biggest reasons that I got baptized a couple weekends ago.
I'm inspired by the way she stands her ground with high school boys because
Thankful for my mom. She was a single mom and she worked and worked and worked. She taught at school, she came home, she gave voice lessons, piano lessons, until I don't even know when, somehow magically dinner appeared.
Girls, I am very proud of all of you, and I am very thankful to have you walking by my side in my life.
The biggest thing that my wife has done in the last couple weeks, going back to the whole baptism, I mean, she was the one that we constantly had talks about it, and she wasn't pushy or anything, but she just laid it out for me and said it needs to be my decision. And come the weekend of the big baptisms, I think for Easter, I decided to make the leap, and the biggest thing was I wasn't going to do it if she wasn't going to be the one baptizing me. So that was definitely something that she's always been in my corner for.
I haven't expressed my thankfulness to my wife as much as I should have. So, honey, if you're watching, thanks.
Glad to be in the room. Glad to be in the room with a bunch of moms. Happy Mother's Day to all of you. We all can probably appreciate how challenging it is to be a mom because most of us are the ones who created the challenges for our moms, right? Rodney Dangerfield, I know I'm dating myself here, but he said, my mom had morning sickness after I was born. And I think, yeah, some of us have caused that a little bit. And, I'm fortunate. I understand that to have a great mom in my life. My mom continues to be, for me, just a source of strength, just a picture of a force, really, of someone who's strong, someone who's been encouraging to me, someone who disciplined me in some really healthy ways, someone who set values in me, just a force in our life. And probably when I think about, what were the big rocks for my mom when we were growing up? One of them is obvious to me. She made it a big, big deal about the idea that in our home, we're just going to tell the truth. Let's not mess around. Let's not tell stories that aren't true. Let's not make things up. The truth is hard sometimes, but let's deal with it. And I'll never forget, I was once going out in my teenage years. I had a girlfriend. Yes, the girlfriend I mentioned in the previous series. We'll just leave that where it is. My brother had a girlfriend, and we were going to a wedding together. And we had talked to my parents about this, of course, beforehand. And we were going to go to the wedding and then go to the reception afterwards with our girlfriends. And my mom said to us before we left, she said, "Hey, it's okay for you to go to the wedding, but you guys cannot go to the reception. That's off limits." She was smarter than we are. She knew some things that might be happening there, some elements that might be involved. She said, "You're not allowed to go to the reception." I said, "Okay." My brother and I took our girlfriends to the wedding, and then we went to the reception. And on the way home from the reception, while we're driving back to our house, my brother and I were having a conversation, right? And you can imagine this conversation. We're like, what are we going to tell mom? What are we going to tell her? Are we going to tell her the truth? Are we going to bald-faced lie about this? Are we going to try to ignore it? Or are we going to try to spin it a little bit so it doesn't sound as bad as it actually was? And we landed on the idea that though it would be painful, the right thing for us to do when we walk in the door is to tell Mom that we did go to the reception, even though she told us not to. And we did tell her that, and it was not a pleasant conversation for me or my brother, and there were some consequences for that. That was a Saturday night. The next morning, on Sunday morning, our whole family is getting in the same vehicle that we took to go to church the next morning. And my mom gets into the passenger seat where I had been sitting the night before, and on the floorboard of the passenger seat was a napkin from the reception that I had dropped there. And I'm like, whew. Thank goodness I told her the truth last night, because that would have been brutal. So, we all have moms in our lives. I'll say, I try to acknowledge this. I've been privileged. I know not everyone has the great experience with a mom that I've had. I really believe a big part of that is that my mom is a sincere follower of Jesus. She has shaped her life around that, and she's shaped her parenting around it, and I am the beneficiary of that. And for all of you moms who are doing the same thing, your kids will be the beneficiaries of that. But today's broader in the message a little bit than just about moms. We're going to talk about the women in our lives, and all of us have a lot of women in our lives, right? I have my mom. I have my wife, who's a fantastic mom herself. I have a daughter. It was just a year ago today that I lost my grandmother, and I had 4 generations of women like that. And I did have one of the ladies in our church come up to me this week. She's like, so let me get this straight, Greg. We did 4 weeks on the kids in our lives, and we're going to do 1 week on the women in our lives. And I'm like, you're used to this, right? Yes, that's the way it is. And when we come to Father's Day, we're going to talk about the men in our lives. And I do want to say that today, in particular, I actually want to talk to the men in the room, much more than I do the women in the room, about the women in our lives. So let me set some context for this that I think appreciates the distinctions between gender, how men and women are not the same, and how the scriptures speak about this. And maybe the best context I can give you is an image that I give you lots of times for context about the way the whole world is created and has unfolded. So if you've ever thought about how does the story of human history work, according to the scriptures, and I believe this is how it works. It started with creation. And when the world was created, God created it to be just the way he wanted it to be. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was harmonious. People actually talked to God in ways that were unfiltered. This is the point of creation. Read Genesis 1 and 2. It's the world just the way God wanted it to be. But it didn't last that way very long. Because human beings have a free will, Adam and Eve, the first human beings, had a free will, and they chose to rebel against God rather than to completely honor God. And we can blame Adam and Eve, but Greg and Jenny would have done the same thing, and so would have you. And so in an instant, instead of the world being harmonious and beautiful and right, it became a broken place. It happens very quickly. We see shame enter into the world in the story of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve's 2 boys, one of them kills the other. I mean, the broken world comes fast. And we still today live in this broken world. It's one of the things I try to remind people about all the time. The world as it is today is not the way God wants it to be. This is a broken world. And all you had to do was open your browser, open the news, whatever it is today. A lot of it's bad news. It is not the way God wants the world to be. And into a messed up world like that, God sent his son, Jesus. And Jesus came for the redemption of a broken world. He does that in a way that's person by person by person by person. You and I get to decide whether we embrace the redemption of Christ, and it changes us from the inside out, and we become new creations with new visions and new priorities. It's beautiful when people experience this forgiveness and this cleansing, this redemption of Christ. And then for people who have experienced that, we call that the church. And the church has a mission on planet Earth to bring that redemption to as many people as possible, but also to bring restoration to a broken world. And in some ways, whenever someone talks to me about the purpose in their life, if they're a follower of Jesus, I think it's almost as simple as this. When you look around at the world and you see something that's broken, it's not the way it's supposed to be. You see a child that doesn't have parents. You see a messed up situation somewhere. You see someone suffering through something. You see something that's broken. Your assignment as a follower of Jesus is to do what you can to bring restoration to the broken world. to put yourself in the back seat and put the needs of this world in the front seat and orient your life around the redemption and restoration of this world. And then the scriptures say that one day in the future, Christ is coming again. And when he does, he will restore all things. All in an instant, the broken world will be no more. And instead, we will have heaven. And heaven actually looks an awful lot like creation. Now, that's the storyline of all of human history. But if you pay attention to this storyline probably fits almost every issue that you and I face in our lives. Think about your story. This is probably your story, especially if you're a follower of Jesus. You were born, you were cute, you were innocent, you were pure. And then you started to make your own decisions. And you went in a way that was a little bit rebellious, or maybe a lot rebellious against God. You made choices that weren't good. It introduced heartache and brokenness into your world. And then at some point, you yielded your life so that you could experience the redemption of Christ, and hopefully you're now restoring a broken world. But since we're talking about women today, can I just describe the history of women as a gender and how it's absolutely reflected in this story. You know, at the creation of the world, I don't know if you know the creation account, but the beauty, the imagery of Genesis 1 tells us that, first God created light in the darkness. And then he created the sea, and he created the land, and then he created plants. And then he created the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. And then he created animals that walked on the ground. And then he created human beings. And I don't know if you noticed this, but what's happening in creation is with each step, God's creation is getting more beautiful. It's getting more complex. It's getting more sophisticated. That's the order of creation. And actually, after each one of those steps, God steps back and reflects on what he created, and he says, and it was good. After there was light, he says, and it was good. After there were plants, he said, and it is good. After there were animals, and it is good. After he created Adam without Eve, he said, it is not good. Actually, what he said is, it is not good for man to be alone. So I will create a suitable partner for him. And while men were created after the animals, women were created after the men. And I think it's a very fair interpretation of the scriptures to say that in that order, the crown jewel of all creation is actually women. And after he created women, he steps back and he doesn't just say it is good, he says, and now it is very good. And so at the very beginning of time, in the moments of creation, women were the crown jewel of creation. You could say the most sophisticated, the most complex, the most beautiful parts of creation. And then came the rebellion. And one of the effects of the rebellion of Adam and Eve, one of the things that marks the brokenness of this world is that women were no longer the crown jewels of creation, and that in fact, it went almost entirely the other direction. And for almost all of human history, women, instead of being at the top and being in a place of honor, instead have been below men and have been put in a place where they are essentially a commodity, where their value is what they can do, what they can produce. Through the eyes of men, their value is for the pleasure that they could bring. For almost all of human history, this is the way that it's done. And this is the broken part of this world. But when Jesus comes onto the scene, he comes into that scene. I know a lot of times we probably read the New Testament and we think, well, the world then was probably the way the world is now. It was not. He walked into a Roman culture where women were commodities. They were used. They were sometimes purchased. Men got the good out of them that they wanted to get, and then they were traded or discarded. They were objects. That is the world that Jesus came into. Not the religious world, just the world. But when Jesus came into the world, on the storyline of the value of women, he started to change everything. Jesus, you know some of these encounters. He encountered a Samaritan woman at the well. She would have been at the lowest of the social class food chain, and he was at the highest. And he just went over to her and he talked with her and he looked her in the eye and he had a conversation. This was scandalous in that day, but Jesus didn't care because women aren't commodities. They're not broken parts of this world. Women are people to be valued, potentially even valued at the pinnacle as the crown jewel of all creation. When Jesus encountered a woman, actually the text says a woman caught in adultery, it is not lost on him that though apparently two people were caught in adultery, that's the way it has to work if you're caught in adultery. Only the woman was standing in front of him. And Jesus refused to play along. He's like, what are we doing here? There's a man who was caught in adultery, there's a woman who's caught in adultery, and you brought the woman. Well, of course you did, because this is a broken world and this is the way that women get treated. But Jesus says, I don't treat women that way. And it was Jesus' voice that allowed that woman to maintain dignity and to not be stoned, killed by a group of men who wanted to place her at a lower level. Over and over again, we see in Jesus' inner circle how he places women in those places. And what's he doing? He's telling us that women experience redemption just as men do. And if we're going to be about restoring the broken world, we will also work at restoring women to the place of honor that they deserve. And so, I want us to have a little bit of a conversation today about how we would embrace that same mission that Jesus embraced in our world. Now, our world is not what the Roman world was in the first century, and yet our world keeps some remnants of a class system, and I think it's mostly up to guys to say, we will be the community, we will be the followers of Jesus that bring a restoration to this broken world. You know, there's a passage in 1 Corinthians 13. It's speaking specifically to guys. And 1 Corinthians 13, you might know this is the chapter that describes love as it is. And right after that description is given, he says, Paul writes this. He says, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I acted like a child, I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put childish things away. And I think in our world today, potentially, that there are men in this world, maybe men in this room, who were brought up with a certain view of women, who have treated women in childish or teenage sorts of ways. And maybe today is the day to say, well, when you were a child, you thought like a child, you reasoned like a child. But now that you're a man, let's put those childish ways away. And I think this is part of our calling. Followers of Jesus reject that women are a commodity. Now, I say this particularly to followers of Jesus. I know in this room we have people who are followers of Jesus. We have some people who aren't followers of Jesus. Listen, if you're not a follower of Jesus, I would love for you also to embrace what Jesus teaches about this, but I don't have any authority in your life, nor does Jesus. So in some ways, this message today is just to the followers of Jesus in the room. That you and I would restore women to their place of honor. This is the crown jewel of all creation. That instead of expecting them to serve us, we serve them, if you're a follower of Jesus. And there's always a little bit of this in me whenever I call on the followers of Jesus to live up to Jesus' name. Now, I'm going to say this. I say it with some hesitation, but there's a part of me that wants to say, and if you're not going to do this with women, then would you stop calling yourself a follower of Jesus? Because followers of Jesus, this is the community. This is what defines us as who we are, that we're bringing restoration to the broken parts of this world. This is what hits me. In John 13, we have a story of Jesus in the upper room with his disciples. There were other people around in the room that day also, and Jesus is washing his disciples' feet. What's happening? Jesus, of course, is in the position of some power. Jesus is the one they're following. He's the rabbi in the room. The others are servants, but he's wrapping a towel around himself and he washes their feet. And then after he does this is what he says. A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And what's he saying? He's saying every time you find yourself in a place where in the existing social strata of a world, that you have some power that other people don't have. It's like, for example, in this room, I have some power you don't have. Whenever you find yourself in that situation, I want you to love people like I loved you. And what did I just do? I just washed your feet. And what am I about to do? I'm about to go to the cross for you. The whole orientation is that you take a position of privilege or a position of power, and you say, whenever I find myself in that position, I will not use it for my own benefit. Instead, I will steward it so as to serve others and restore the broken world. It's Jesus who said, I did not come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. And at the end of right after this sentence, actually in John chapter 13, it says, and this is how you'll know who are my disciples. This is how you know who the followers of Jesus are. They're the ones who are loving one another. And so I want you to think with me just for a little bit about some specific places. And I want you to see how often in the scripture this theme shows up in the New Testament to say, oh, we have to have a reorientation of our life, particularly as guys, to women. And there's some specific relationships that are mentioned. So let's start with this. Your wife. Let me speak to the husbands in the room for a moment. The way you treat your wife is a big deal. It's a big deal because the scriptures teach us a certain way and Jesus is modeling a certain way. Let me make this very practical though. Guys, the way you treat your wife is the first and most powerful lesson to your sons about how a guy should treat a lady. The way that you treat your wife is the first and most powerful lesson to your sons about how a man should treat a woman. When I think about the North Star of my life and how I treat my wife, I remember that Terrell and Jackson and Davion, who live under my roof, are watching how I treat Jenny. And it is the first and most powerful lesson to them about how a man ought to treat a woman. And the scripture's not unclear about this. In Ephesians chapter 5, it says this, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That the orientation of a husband is that you would give yourself up for your wife. You would serve her. You would give up your life for her, just as Christ did the church. Now, this is so fascinating because I talk to young guys, especially guys who are about to get married, about this all the time. And I say, hey, this is a big calling. You're supposed to give your life for your wife. Would you give your life for your wife? And whenever I say that, this happens all the time. Guys' eyes get real big, real big. They're like, oh yeah, I would give my life for my wife. Like, you mean like if a bullet was coming for her and someone, maybe me, needed to jump in front of the bullet, or like the car crashed and nobody could get her out, but I could get her out and I carry her off to safety just as the car explodes? Oh, I would risk my life for my wife. And I'm like, guys are the only people in the world who can create serving someone to turn themselves into a hero. And I'm like, listen, if you ever need to rush into a burning car and save your wife, please do that, but that's not what this is about. My question goes something like this. Will you rub her shoulders? I don't know. Will you be the one who always gets up and gets her a glass of iced tea? Like if she's overwhelmed next month, will you say, hey, honey, I'll do the grocery shopping? I think that's the real life picture of I'm giving my life for her. And our sons, and frankly our daughters, are watching. And you and I, in this marriage relationship, have the great chance to be about the restoration of this broken world and return women to being the crown jewel of all creation. It's not just for wives. Let's talk about your mother or your grandmother. If your mother is living, if you have a grandmother who's living, I want you to picture them right now, no matter how old they are. I want you to picture them and say, oh, there's a way, guys especially, a way we treat our mothers and our grandmothers that really matters when it comes to following Jesus. There's this fascinating passage. It's in a letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. Timothy's the pastor of a church, so he's kind of trying to guide a church on how to think about this. And this is what he writes. He says, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. Now, this is a big deal for a church, including our church. Like, if there's widows who, they don't have any support in their life and they're potentially destitute, like a church ought to come around them and support them and do what they can. That's a big calling of a church for widows who are really in need, but not all widows. That's what he's going to say next. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. And I understand. You can be in a kind of stressful situation in life when you're raising kids yourself and your parents are aging. But I am calling on everybody in this room to say that for what you're caring for your mother, caring for your grandmother, this is a big deal. This speaks in terms of repaying. And if you've had a great relationship with your mom like I have, I just think, well, I could never repay her. It would literally be impossible for me to do enough for my mom at this stage to repay her for what she has done for me. And I've had this modeled for me. My dad cared for his mom. When she couldn't manage the farm anymore, my dad stepped in and managed the farm. When there were decisions to be made about her care, when finances were an issue, my dad stepped in and did this for his mom. And there's something very noble and very inspiring about men who would care for their mothers and care for their grandmothers and set them as a priority. It's part of restoring this crown jewel of creation back to where it should be. So we have our wives, we have our mothers and our grandmothers, but let me broaden this out to a conversation practically about all women, but maybe we think in these categories. A lot of us have women who are friends of ours, women who are coworkers of ours, women who are classmates of ours, women who are neighbors of ours. And I think this is a really important thing to acknowledge in this room, that sometimes men do not relate to the women around us who we're not related to in ways that are healthy. Again, the scriptures help us with this. This is in the same chapter where Paul is writing to Timothy. He gives us a framework. He says, treat younger men as brothers. We're going to skip that one. Maybe I'll talk about that on Father's Day. Treat older women as mothers. Now, I know what you're going to ask me, like, well, Greg, what's older women? You want me to give you an age? You think I'm going to do that here? I'm not going to do that here. I think older is actually just a comparison word, so I think you could do this. That's how I try to think about it. I'm like, well, older than me. Older than me. And when I relate to women who are older than me, when you relate to women who are older than you, that woman might be your boss. She might be the woman who lives next door. When you relate to women who are older than you, the scriptures, guys, give us a framework for this. It says, hey, treat them like you'd treat your mother. Any woman who's older than you, give her the respect that you would give your mother. And younger women. So this is all the women in your life who are younger than you. Maybe they work for you. Maybe they live next door. Maybe you see them at the gym. And you should treat the younger women as sisters with absolute purity. With absolute purity, with no hint of impurity. And guys, can we just acknowledge in the room together, we're not so good at this. That it actually takes someone who's been transformed by Christ, probably, to, in those situations, not only do this yourself, but potentially be a voice for it. I mean, we kind of throw around culturally the notion of locker room talk, right? But the reason it's called locker room talk is because I've been in a lot of locker rooms where the talk was like that. And when we're talking about younger women, I mean, the conversation becomes lewd. It becomes about their bodies. You talk about, it happens. Can we all just acknowledge, guys, that happens? I literally was in a locker room once, a little bit embarrassed to tell you that I didn't interrupt the conversation. I let it go. I didn't participate, but I absolutely didn't step into it. I was in a conversation once where this was happening, and someone was talking about a young girl and about her body and saying things that should not be said about women. And during this conversation, literally, her brother walked into the locker room. And he said, "Don't talk about my sister like that." And it makes sense in the moment. Well, yeah, you wouldn't treat someone's sister like that. That's Paul's image. Treat younger women as sisters with absolute purity. To treat them any other way is to treat them as a commodity. And followers of Jesus, at least, won't do that. Now, let me take a slightly different angle at this and just build off this statement. Followers of Jesus return women to a place of honor. And here, as I kind of finish up the message, I want to talk to guys again for a minute, and then I want to talk particularly to ladies about how you relate to other women, because the scriptures lead us in both of these areas. So it is a high calling for men to lift up women, to be the kind of guys who would elevate the women in our lives, put them into places of honor, to treat them honorably. This is what the scriptures say, actually. Get this. Treat them with respect as the weaker partner. Now, I know what some of you are thinking, like, you're going to have to explain that one, Greg. Well, let me explain it. Treat them with respect. This word respect is so fascinating. The New Testament's written in Greek. The word respect shows up many other places in the New Testament, but this is actually a unique Greek word that's only used one time in the whole New Testament, and the best English word we could put to it was respect. But let me tell you literally what it means. It means to grant them honor, to assign them honor. And this is different than treating them in a way they've earned. This is a grant. This is not an earn. Some guys in my life will sometimes say, "Oh, I don't have to treat her with honor. She's not an honorable woman." And I'd say, "Oh, actually, at least for followers of Jesus, this doesn't have to do with whether they're an honorable woman or not. It has to do with the idea that they're a woman. And women are to be honored. And so we grant them, we treat them honor, not based on how they're behaving, not based on our judgment of whether they're honorable. We just restore things to the way the world was created." Now, it says, as the weaker partner. And almost all of us know this at this stage. Women physically are weaker, right? I just think about Jenny and I. She's smarter than I am. She's more discerning than I am. She's more perceptive than I am. She's more resilient than I am. She's more disciplined than I am. But arm wrestling, I beat her every time. Every time. So there's a physical strength, which in the first century might meant right. And if you had the physical strength, you used it. But can we also acknowledge that culturally, women remain the weaker partner? That culturally, that's just still true? That if you pay attention to media, you pay attention to music, you pay attention to movies, you pay attention to what we listen to, you pay attention to the way that conversations get cast, oftentimes women remain treated as a commodity. Guys, can I just say two things to you in the most practical way I can think about it? Some of you have music on your playlist, and it refers to women as bitches and whores. And if you're a follower of Jesus, I want to ask you, within a half an hour of this service being done, would you eliminate any music on your playlist that refers to women as bitches or whores? This is the commodity, right? This is naming women as something that's subhuman in some ways. And you might say, oh, this is just a cultural thing. I don't care. It's a bad cultural thing if it's a cultural thing. To start to categorize an entire group as bitches and whores. I just hope that we would lead the way and say, no more. We're not doing that anymore. Some of you might empty that off your playlist tonight, and you might be like, now there's nothing left on my playlist. Well, good for you. Good for you. Guys, I had someone tell me a number of years ago, Greg, you should do a sermon telling guys how bad it is to look at naked women. And I'm like, guys don't need a sermon for that. Everybody knows it's bad to look at naked women. I was wrong. I mean, the stats are not unclear, and trust me, it's not just those not followers of Jesus who are doing this. That's not what's going on. To let your eyes land on erotic imagery is essentially the definition of making women a commodity. Turning them into an object. And guys do this as a pastime. And I don't know if you know this is what's going on, guys, but when you do this as a pastime, you are a student and you're learning something. And among the things that you're learning are that one woman will never be sufficient. I don't know any guys who look at porn or like, I just go back and watch the same video again and again. They don't do that. They need something different. And something's getting rewired in your brain to tell you one woman isn't sufficient. And certainly, one of the things being rewired in your brain is to say, and your wife certainly isn't sufficient. And this is so wild to me that there would be almost any argument against this. Listen, I understand the temptation. What I don't understand is guys deciding they're going to give into this and then repeatedly giving into it and letting it become a habit and a pattern of your life. People say this all the time. It's not hurting anybody. I'm like, oh. Yeah, it's hurting people. This is not a pastime. It's a pathway. It's a pathway to rewire your brain for your relationship with your own wife or a future wife to be diminished. It's actually a pathway that, if all the guys in the world stopped watching porn, human trafficking would end tomorrow. Yes, it would. This has consequences. And so, guys, to honor the women in our lives, to value them, not as commodities or objects, to restore them as the crown jewel of all creation. I'm calling on you to eliminate that from your life. Now, before I go, let me say this. There is also a high calling for women lifting up women. I don't know why this is, but there are almost endless sociological studies that say one of the dynamics that does happen as women rise in our world is that women undermine other women. And I want to encourage you to think clearly about this as a woman yourself, as a follower of Jesus, to say, don't create a competition. Instead, let's lift one another up. The scriptures, again, there's so much wisdom about this in the scriptures. Follow this. Likewise, let me actually tell you where I taught this passage. 10 years ago, I was in an audience of women at Suncrest. There were about 100 women together, and I taught this passage to that group of 100 women. That's what it says. Likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. And in that setting, I called on the older women to say, hey, we need you to do this. At that time, my daughter was in the children's ministry at Suncrest. Last weekend, I picked my daughter up after her freshman year of college. But I cast a vision 10 years ago to this group of women to say, my daughter's going to grow up in this church. And she, structurally in our church, there are no limitations for where women can serve. I want her experience personally with older women in this church to be the same. But isn't it possibly true that what the scriptures are naming here are some of the greatest temptations? To not be reverent in the way you live, and that might show up as slander, even in a community of women. Slander, gossip, call it what you want. Competing with someone else, pushing someone else down to lift yourself up. Talking to your daughter about your daughter-in-law. Talking to your friend about your neighbor. Doing all the things that actually salaciously just push people down instead of constantly thinking, no. Anyone that I'm older than, I got to lift them up. And I got to set the example, because not only are my sons watching how I treat my wife, but my daughter is watching how you treat other women. Then the older women can urge the younger women to love their husbands and to love their children, to be a voice of encouragement, to be a model for what a Christian woman would be, and start to create a world, and this is the beauty of the restored world, where we serve one another. After I did that talk 10 years ago, I got an email from a lady in our church. She was in her mid-30s at the time, and this is what she wrote to me. She said, "Loved hearing your heart for your daughter. Wanted to let you know that you can count on me to be a positive example for her. Thanks for trusting us women with influencing her." And I think that's what I'm doing. That's what we're doing. I'm trusting the women in our church to influence the girls in our church. So, followers of Jesus, let's do our part to restore the broken part of this world that has pushed women down, and do all we can to restore them to being the crown jewel of all creation.
We know that getting involved in a place like Suncrest can be intimidating. Trying to find where all the helpful information is can be overwhelming. Well, we've made it really easy. Suncrest.org/top4 has regularly updated information that'll help you on your faith journey and your journey here at Suncrest. Visit on our app, on our website, or by scanning the QR code on the seats if you're visiting us in person.
Darkness run for cover, but the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. I believe in signs and wonders. I have resurrection power. Still the miracle that I just can't get over, my name is registered in heaven. Oh, my praise belongs to you forever. This is my testimony from death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous. I'll testify. This is my testimony. This is my testimony. Sons and daughters, bought with blood and washed in water. Sing the praises of the Spirit, Son and Father. Our God will finish what He started. Oh, our God my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous. I'm justified. This is my testimony. Oh, I'm alive. This is my testimony. From death to life. 'Cause grace rewrote my story. I'll testify by Jesus Christ the righteous. I'm justified. This is my testimony. This is my testimony.
Every week, we pause everything we do, both in person and on demand, to focus on the love of Jesus during a time we call communion. It's where in person we take bread and juice, but online and on demand, find whatever food and drink is available to you. This represents Jesus' body, his blood that was broken and poured out for us on the cross, so that we might know what real love in life can look like. This is a moment for those of us who follow Jesus to recenter, refuel, and refocus us on his love and what he has called us to do. If you're watching this and you wouldn't define yourself as someone who follows Jesus, you're exploring, or maybe you're just not comfortable with this moment, I'm glad you're watching, because Suncrest is an amazing place to ask all of your questions about what following Jesus looks like, why we do it, alongside lots of other people on the same journey as you. I'm going to put a timer, some scripture on the screen here shortly, and you can feel free to eat, drink, and reflect when you're ready. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Suncrest On Demand. If you liked it, hit the like button. If you want to see more content like this from Suncrest Church, hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, go ahead and hit the share button. We'll join you next time as we're kicking off a brand new series we're calling Wrestling. Bye now.